Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Digging Deeper Moment number 196. The purpose of our Digging Deeper Moments is to take God's Word to God's world, and we are so glad that you've joined us. If you would, please take a moment to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you. Tonight, we continue in our series, Is the Bible Historically Reliable? We answer this with another question. How good were the Jews in recording history? The answer is very good. One of the inspirations for doing this series was that I was reading through the book called A History of the Jews by Paul Johnson. And as I progressed through his book, I was struck by the number of times he stated an achievement by Israel. And he shared how unique Israel was in history and how they were unique in recording history. For instance, speaking of Israel's discovery of monotheism, the belief in one God, he writes, "The discovery of monotheism, and not just of monotheism, but of a sole omnipotent God, actuated by ethical principles and seeking methodically to impose them on human beings, is one of the greatest turning points in history, perhaps the greatest of all." This doctrine has roots in the Ten Commandments found in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 3. And God spoke all these words, saying, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me." Stephen Meyer, in his book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, makes the case that monotheism was absolutely essential for the birth of modern science. And by implication, this means that the Jews were instrumental in creating the way of life we now enjoy. So in comparing Israel with the Egyptians, Paul Johnson writes, "The Egyptians were extraordinarily skillful in using their hands, but they had little sense of a cumulative as opposed to repetitive sense of time, and so no true grasp of history." In other words, they didn't get history because they just saw it as cyclical. And when he speaks of the Mesopotamians, he adds, "The worldview in Mesopotamian cultures of the 3rd and 2nd millennium BC was very different than that of Egypt," emphasis mine. "It was much more dynamic, but also more confused. Therefore, it's only the Jews who had a worldview, monotheism, that lent itself to recording history in the modern sense of the word." And that is what the Bible is. It's a history of God's working in history. For it was the Jews who were the first to write what we call history. Johnson goes on to say, "Hence the Jews were above all historians, and the Bible is essentially a historical work from start to finish." He adds, "The Jews developed the power to write terse and dramatic historical narrative half a millennium before the Greeks, who are usually considered the fathers of history. And because they constantly added to their historical records, they developed a deep sense of historical perspective, which the Greeks never attained." In other words, the Jewish people were great historians. And these are the words of Paul Johnson, a historian, not a theologian. He's not a preacher trying to preach any particular message. He's saying the Jews were good at history. And this is a mouthful because the Greeks are usually the ones historians turn to champion as the fathers of history. Specifically, the Greek historian Herodotus, who lived sometime between 484 and 413 BC. But by the time of Herodotus, the Jews have been writing history for 1,000 years. That makes me wonder why the Jews don't get more credit for having invented modern history. The answer to that question could also be the reason that Jews don't get more credit for the invention of writing. When I went to Bible school many years ago, conventional wisdom was that the Phoenicians were the inventors of the alphabetic script, making them the father of modern writing. But within my lifetime, that idea has been greatly challenged by archaeologists. And while the verdict is still out, at least 2 archaeologists that I'm familiar with now believe that the Jews may have invented the alphabetic script themselves, and hence modern writing. And that would be David Rohl and Douglas Petrovich. And by the way, when I was in Bible college, I read material that stated that the Bible was wrong when it says in Exodus 24:4, "And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. Then he took the book of the covenant and read in the hearing of the people." The argument back then was the Bible was wrong because writing hadn't been invented yet. That's all changed. We now know for sure that the alphabetic script predates Moses by up to 500 years, and it might have been the Jews themselves that developed it. And specifically, according to David Rohl, he believes that Joseph was the one who invented the first alphabet. But as I stated, this theory is still being debated. But we certainly have come a long way from saying that Moses couldn't have written the Torah because the writing hadn't been invented yet. In fact, what we now know is that Israel was a literate culture from early on. And the driving force behind their literacy was the desire to read and write the words of the Lord to their own history. So the Jews were the first and the best at recording history in the ancient world. So I'm going to end where I began with a quote from Paul Johnson. After speaking of the Jews being the ones who developed linear history, he writes, In the portrayal of character, too, the biblical historians achieved a degree of perception and portraiture which even the best Greek and Roman historians could never manage. There is nothing in Thucydides to equal the masterly presentation of King David, composed evidently by an eyewitness at his court. That's a tell right there, an eyewitness at his court. The Jews, he says, like all good historians, kept a good balance between biography and narrative. Most of the books of the Bible have a historical framework, all related to their wider framework, which might be entitled A History of God and His Relations to Man. So, were the Jews good historians? Absolutely. Next week, we're going to finish our series by answering the question, can we trust the Bible text or the biblical text that have been handed down to us, or have they been corrupted? If this lesson's helped you, please share it with a friend, like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or check out our Sunday morning live podcast on either app or Spotify. And hey, if you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do that. It will help us spread messages like this one to others. Thank you. I hope to see you next week.